Okay. I think it's really interesting that you ask me to tell you the story of the project from the beginning, because one of the things that's central to this work and central to all of the work that I've been doing over the last, I'd say, decade or longer, is that there really isn't a beginning, and there really isn't a sense of time that has a linear nature. This project in some ways has evolved, and now that I'm thinking about it, it's a kind of complex term, but that it has evolved in such a way that I've been interested in how a work can behave like a network or like a set of nodes rather than a story or a set of terms that define one another. So I think in many ways this project evolved as a set of discrete kind of investigations that had intertwined links and borrowed from one another. And I had been very interested in thinking about this networked condition largely because I wanted to understand how our navigation of space and our experience of space is not congruous with a map or a drawing, because a drawing or a map somehow is too determinate. It always lays out the terms. And I wanted us to be able to think about how the experience of space is an always changing thing, because the space is changing and the light is changing and the air is changing and the sound is changing and our sense of others and closeness and nearness and far is changing. And so there's no capacity we have to freeze that into some kind of a fixed condition or a linear condition. And if you think of us as cohabiting a space with each other and with other inanimate and animate beings, then those timelines get very confused. So this project really began by trying to imagine how we could set up and make us aware of that complexity. And I was looking for ways to allow us to experience our effect and our distant, the kind of consequences of a distant gesture or a movement that was not immediately in our surrounding. And to do that, I have been exploring this concept of linkages and how our energy as we move through space can affect something that's far away, or seemingly far away, and that energy, as it's transmitted and has this, let's say, effect, changes the world of someone else. And I actually think this sounds so abstract, but it is abstract. So it seemed like actually the best way to transmit this energy was not through an obvious sort of materially congruous thing, but through the gap between us and that which occupies the gap between us, which is air. And I have been thinking about how to use air both as a way of transmitting energy, but also as a way of shaping the movement of things so that the air can have a kind of compression or a kind of dampening or a kind of cushioning to the way things move. And it also has a kind of rhythmic change because of the way it is a flowing substance or non-substance. I'm not sure what it is exactly. So I had been playing with these pneumatic actuators, which really are just a bunch of air pumps, and thinking about how if you activate one of them, they will extend that energy across a very long distance and have a resultant sort of airflow, which can activate another object. And before I arrived at the atelier, I had been investigating this, And just before I arrived, or about a year before, let's say 6 months before I arrived, I had been in residence at a biorobotics lab in Lausanne at the EPFL. And this laboratory was interested in intelligent systems. And by intelligent systems, they were thinking that rather than engineering, let's say, kind of biomimicry robot, they wanted to understand living life as a larger systemic set of flows. And so that whatever they designed was not simply a mimesis of an organism, but in fact somehow integrated into larger organic infrastructures and systems. And that was incredibly important to me because I wanted to develop a system that was a responsive system and integrated into both human behavior and non-human behavior. So that was the first thing that was happening kind of as I was developing these air conditions. And then the second thing that was very important was that they were looking specifically at flying organisms and largely at birds. And because of that, because they were building these flying robots, all of the materials they were using in this laboratory were incredibly light. And I had never been around this material before. It was a really new experience for me. And there were lots of scraps of the material lying around, which were free to be used by anyone occupying the lab. And so I had the incredible good fortune of finding myself in a space with tremendous amounts of resources and tools to start playing with these very lightweight materials and start putting these lightweight materials together with this pneumatic network. And I found that there was a tremendous amount that could be done because suddenly you could move something that appeared to be a very large mass using very, very little energy. And that had a huge amount of potential. But it also set up a challenge because you could move something that was a, let's say, thing-like, but that thing in the scale of a space that's much greater somehow disappears. So about 6 months before I arrived at Atelier Calder, I came here to look at the space. And I was incredibly struck by both the scale of the space and the scale of the space around the space and the complexity of the room that is not often what we consider. For example, the beams that hold up the ceiling and the beams that support the floor. And I wanted to engage the situation at a scale that was much greater than the scale of these lightweight large objects. And I thought that one way to think about extending one's reach is not just extending through the energy of air, but extending through other energies. So you can extend that energy through vibration, you can extend that energy through, let's say, gravitational force, but you can also extend that energy through electricity or light. And I realized that I could, in fact, embed within these large carbon tubes light pieces that would then extend their reach in a much greater way and amplify the change in motion. So that was a really exciting thing. It also would start to call attention to those parts of this space and this structure that somehow didn't appear obviously visible on first glance. So all of this in some ways was at the sort of were a set of terms that I was working with before I arrived. And about 3 months before I came here, or actually more like the 6 months prior to my arrival here, I really made a decision to build a series of one-to-one prototypes to really test all of the different permutations and uh, behaviors of the system. And I think that that was an incredibly exciting process for me, because I understood that I could test it and sort of think of these as nodes, but I could never understand their behavior as a full network, because there was only one of each, and they were partial, and they were sort of provisional. So when I arrived here, I think one of the most exciting and challenging moments was starting to sort of get a sense of the space. And that had to do with, in some ways, mapping out what is already here, and also translating what is experienced above to what is experienced below in the basement, which is not visible. And that translation had to do with mapping, actually, the beams of the ceiling and dropping these strings. We tied small nuts to the bottom of them as like plumb lines to try to understand how the beams would fall and map onto the beams in the basement, so that we could think about this network as having both a lateral extension but also a vertical extension. And that became sort of the first experience of the space, was just moving through it and marking the surfaces of it and understanding where it was. And I think that process for me is a really important, because in some ways when I encounter any kind of space, I'm always struck by how baffling it is to translate that space from a drawing. Because you look at a plan and you think you know it, but then you're in the space and it's a radically different thing, and it feels different, and it smells different, and it has moisture, and it has sound, and it has all of these qualities that you don't know. So there's something about kind of living the drawing in your body that extends in the space that I think was a real gift in being here, because I could really spend time in considering how these nodes could occupy the space. And then the other thing that became very important and happened very early on during my stay was trying one of the modules which had never really been explored, which was this long rubber band that extended about 150 meters. And as you pulled this band, you created a translation of this vertical energy into the reciprocating motion of this pneumatic actuator. And you start this kind of rhythmic pumping of air in the basement. And I think one of the things that was shocking to me was how these lines were an incredible opportunity, because you could, I think because in the past I've always struggled with how the thing that you contact always blinds you to everything else, because it obscures your view or it blocks your body. But these were so forgiving. I mean, they're basically just these slender rubber bands. You could walk through them, you can pull them, you can twist them, but they never obstruct anything, and yet they're very, very insistent on their position. They become kind of markers of space. And they also had this very slight tremor or vibration. And the vibration was extraordinary, because the vibration suggested the energy that was passing through them. And so the first thing that happened after this sort of marking of the space was the tensioning of these rubber bands and the placement of actuators in the basement. And once that had happened, there became a kind of process of thinking about how these vertical column-like elements would respond and be situated in relation to the bands. And that also was a whole new experience, because first there were all of these sort of complex things that began to happen with light. And I think that happened simultaneously with this marking of space. When I arrived here, I realized that this beautiful room is saturated with daylight, and there was no way that our lights were going to be visible. They were much, much too dim. And that involved a really wonderful collaborative process with Guillaume, who is making this film, and thank you, who developed these many different options for illuminating the system. And because he is such an inventor himself, I think found an incredible solution, which was a motorcycle headlamp, which we cut up and jerry-rigged and were actually able to wire ultimately into the piece by rebuilding many of the inner workings of the system. And that involved a lot of lens testing and nighttime projection and daytime projection and conversations with collaborators in the US and abroad who were lens specialists and optics specialists. But ultimately, we sort of combined them into these vertical columnar elements. And then the question was how to link these energetic rubber bands, which I call G9s, with the vertical modules or mod Vs. And that was a whole other incredible process here, because so often when I put something together, I have a very tight timeline. And this was so extraordinary because I was basically living in this space for months. And it meant that everything could be tested and reconsidered. So everything was placed, but the connections between them, so when you touch one, you actually would change the position of another. The connections between them were not decided. And one of my collaborators, Simon Jaeger from the Laboratory of Intelligent Systems, had come out for a week to develop a code to think about our options for networking these systems. And he spent a tremendous amount of time, donated a tremendous amount of energy to coming up with routing patterns. And I was really excited. We had all of the pneumatic tubing coming up through the flooring, and we could just basically switch out our circuits and see how the system behaved and how the energy transmitted across very long distances, across short distances, between 1 and 1, between 1 and 3. And it allowed this sort of networked or nodal system to have many lives, even though at the time that this festival occurred, there was one iteration in place. So that's a lot of detail, I suppose, but I think that for me, this period has been an incredible experiment, and it's been incredible to have so much preparation in place in order to test so many things while we were putting it together. And also to learn, I've learned so much about how this work can grow in the future, and this work has a kind of scalar potential, and it has a kind of playful potential. And I think that is the last sort of critical part, which was that after it was here, it wasn't just that there was time to develop it in its forming, but after it was sort of in place, then there were all these people. And they were all different people, like every day different people would come. And so I could observe how people dealt with it. And that was also extraordinary because it was such a provisional kind of temporary thing, but it meant that I could see it almost like a large laboratory with endless test subjects streaming in and out, and see, you know, what propensity people had. And also there was a really extraordinary process that had been set up by Corinne which had to do with how people would navigate the space. So people were welcomed into the upstairs, and Corinne had an extraordinary team of people here to facilitate their manipulation of the work. And then the team would lead people downstairs into the basement, and people had to exit the building and walk down this long grass ramp, which I'm looking out on right now. And that in itself was kind of amazing, that you have to go outside the building to go inside the building again. And then you'd come into the basement, and in the basement, it's a very raw, I mean, the whole space is raw, but the basement is really raw, and all these tools and everything around, and a sand floor. And above, you could see the people operating the system, because you could experience the Gen 9 sort of movement of these pistons. And you somehow understood that the system was pneumatic and it was human powered, and that it was human energy flowing through the floorboards, and people then would come back upstairs voluntarily to try to sense it again. And that taught me a lot about the time of learning a work as a viewer, that a viewer doesn't simply have a simultaneous relationship to it, but they build their own timeline of absorbing a work. And I think that's something that's been in my work for years, because I've often made works that span multiple floors, and so people need to go between floors to understand the work, and then they understand their relation to themselves and others through that process. But it also allowed me to see how a network could behave, both that you're understanding it on one floor, like how you touch something and you affect something distant, but also how you then also understand the mechanism as a separate space of understanding. And I have so many things to do with that new knowledge. I have so much new knowledge, and I think in many ways this time here will just continue to feed my work for decades, actually. I think there's just so much I've absorbed that I haven't been able to think through yet. So I'm so grateful for it.